Ed Crossman to the podium.
Thank you, Mike. I can assure you there was no collusion on the draw we just made. Dick was a guide, was one of the guides I fished with at the World Muskie Hunt a couple of years ago, but while he let me use his tackle, I'm sure he gave me the wrong rod because I didn't catch a fish. My function this afternoon is not to present a great quantity of new raw data analyzed with the newest and most sophisticated techniques, because that's what you're going to hear from the panelists that will come after me. I chose as my job the task of laying the groundwork for the others who will take care of the details, and to attempt to introduce the animal itself if I can, although you might assume that this animal needs no introduction to this audience. As you can see from the program, I have used the word "this noble beast." It is not a real quotation. It is just an example of my attitude towards an animal that has allowed me to make my living basically working with it, and an animal that has given you a great deal of enjoyment. And I think from that standpoint qualifies for nobility. I suggest that I would encourage you all to stay through the sessions that are to come, because they are the important part and the parts from which we will get the kind of transfer of information that will allow all of us to make as much use of past activity and one another's interests and expertise in order to make sure that the noble beast can go on for quite some time. The concept of nobility has often been said to include such things as grandeur, titles, folklore, controversy, place names, and statuary. And of course the muskellunge certainly complies and certainly fulfills all of these requirements, and it's one of the reasons why I think we can call it a noble animal. No noble animal certainly has better statuary than there is at the Hall of Fame in Hayward. I don't think any nobleman in Europe ever had a statue quite as imposing as that particular one. And as I've said in the paper that goes along with this, many of the mounts that are in homes and public places around North America and elsewhere would have done the ancient Egyptians proud in regard to the mummification of remains. So we've got the kind of statuary that noble people were used to. Noble people normally have places named after them, and it's rather interesting not to go into this in any great detail, that again this fish applies in that there's a place called Muskie on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, and some of you may be aware or may be interested to know that the town of Racine in Wisconsin had at one time considered calling itself the town of Muskellunge as a result of the large number of fish that were known to come into the river at that particular place. Grandeur it has in strength. Grandeur it has in the size. The fact that if you are to break the world's record, you're going to have to catch a 70-pound fish. The concepts of 3/4 of an hour battle, all of these things fit into any man's estimate of what could be called grandeur. Folklore, we haven't had as long first slide please. We haven't had as long a history of contact with the muskellunge, probably only 200 or 300 years, as there has been with the pike in Europe. And of course, we don't have pub signs in North America to any great extent as they do over there, but I would expect that soon the degree of folklore that's associated with Esox lucius, the northern pike, or the pike in Europe, will be followed by the same sort of attitude towards this particular animal. There is a tendency in the old country to have a greater degree of correspondence or journalism for the angler. And here we have the Angler's Mail, only one of two principal angling newspapers that appear weekly in Great Britain and are read avidly. On Thursdays when this paper appears, there's generally only two topics of conversation: fishing and football. and quite often fishing wins out in this regard in England. And I think we'll find that the muskellunge is very quickly following in the footsteps of this particular situation. Titles. All nobility had foreign-sounding titles to go along with the stature and the status they had. And what can be more resounding and foreign-sounding than Esox Maskenongi, the muskellunge? With a bit of music and some trumpets, it might be the opening line for Superman 4. But it certainly is a title and a resounding one. Like nobles, it's steeped in mystery, this title. The name was given this animal supposedly in 1824, but within 20 years, there was no longer any opportunity to examine the original description of the fish, and very shortly after that time, in the mid-1800s, there was in fact considerable doubt that the muskellunge had ever been described in the way appropriate to the description of a new species. And so we are more or less going on faith that there was an original description, that is the right name, and that the animal is in fact properly registered with the proper authorities. But I think we'll go on without any considerable fear. There's been a constant debate over the common names. There's something like 94 of them, which I'm sure most of you have come in contact with at times. And this debate involves what native tongue, what Indian tribe, what words, in fact, were the source of that common name, and the linguistic process that is used or can be used to derive the major terms that led down to the common name today. And those terms are basically Maskenonge from the French, and of course muskellunge, and all the many other derivatives of that. So this complication led to the point where in the 1800s the two species, the pike and the muskellunge, were so badly confused that you cannot in fact be sure without an illustration, and even sometimes then, which particular fish an author is talking about when he uses either of those names in the literature of the mid-1800s. So if you're reading that kind of literature, be very careful, you might be led astray. The problem of naming this animal, the problem of trying to settle what we were talking about, was not eased. In fact, it was even complicated more so by the movement westward, by the increased opportunity for people to come in contact with fish that were called in the frontier country, which was basically the Ohio River country, and then farther west into the area in which we stand now. And of course, the variability of markings on the animal led to 3 different forms, 3 different muskellunge, 3 different species, and we are still arguing whether we're talking subspecies or races or populations just with some sort of geographic and environmental difference. We have not resolved this to everyone's satisfaction. You will hear something about this in the conference. No decision this week will satisfy everyone, and I'm sure that that particular controversy will go on. This animal did not help in any way. This animal was at one time described as Esox amentus when it was captured at the fishing camp of Mike Ament on Lake of the Woods, if I remember correctly. And it turned out later on to be what is now the very famous or infamous tiger muskellunge, the hybrid between the two. But of course, until we got things sorted out in the early 1900s, this added still another name and the idea of a 4th kind of muskellunge, which really confused the thing further. Still another animal of considerable interest is the animal on the screen now largely known as the silver pike. It is Esox lucius, a northern pike or pike. But at one time this animal was thought to be a silver muskellunge, a muskellunge without its black pattern. And in fact the animal was used to create crosses, to spawn with muskellunge when they were short of sperm. And as a result, we were having tiger muskellunge liberated in public waters long before we assumed that this was going on. The distribution. There's a map of this in the banquet hall, which is used to peg the location of the various mounts that you see there. What's rather interesting here is the changes that have taken place. You see the striped yellow as the present range of the animal without divisions for the various groupings. but they're fairly obvious and fairly easily to designate from the area you see. You see a green area which probably constitutes an area lost to the range of the muskellunge as a result of habitat changes from agriculture in recent times. You see a red area that probably designates the range of the muskellunge probably shortly before white man came to North America. And then the blue area, which I've only added this year and whose borders are completely imaginary, and that there's no way of telling exactly what's going on. The only basis for it actually was this one spot in Oregon, and that is there on the idea that there are fossil remains of the muskellunge found at that particular site from some 25 million years ago. And this is not hard to imagine because the muskellunge is part of a fauna that we know well that at one time had a much wider range in North America. And in the last few years we have in fact found something out about the probable ancestor of the muskellunge in North America, a species from 50 million years ago that almost completely resembles the northern pike. And the one and only specimen, or the few specimens that we know of, only happen to have come from Western Canada and can be dated back to about 50 million years and have been given the name Esox temani, and this is the probable pike-like ancestor which gave rise to the more modern Esox maskinongi, the muskellunge. You've seen the pattern. How did it get here? Well, being in Wisconsin is rather appropriate because much of what we know today of fish distribution is derived from our knowledge of the most recent glacial period, which is named after this state, the Wisconsin glaciation. And what you see in front of you is a contribution to a particular fauna. You don't need to look at the figures to any great extent. They represent contributions to the Hudson Bay fauna, basically, but it rather graphically represents the source of northern fishes. The very heaviest part of them came from a refugium where fishes were overwintering in this part of the Mississippi Valley. Some came this way, some came out of a driftless or ice-free area in Alaska and the Yukon. And the one we're concerned with is this big broad bar in the Mississippi, and that's where the muskellunge came from. It came north as pathways were made available to it. This is a picture in the country we're in, basically, about 12,000 or 13,000 years ago, with Lake Agassiz on the left, still connected to the Mississippi River and providing a path northward, and other pathways literally into the Great Lakes, although you must remember that the water is flowing south, but still providing a northern pathway for the fishes which overwintered in the Mississippi Valley. And here's the situation about 10,000 years ago, or 9,500, when Lake Agassiz was no longer connected to the Mississippi River, and we had certain other kinds of connections in these northern tributaries of the Mississippi. And it's possible from this to suggest that since the muskellunge does not occur to the west, it did not use the Lake Agassiz access, and as a result we can suggest that the muskellunge came north about 9,000 years ago into the territory of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ontario, and across possibly into Quebec this way or up through the Great Lakes to get to Quebec. As a result, what we can look at is what did the animal probably look like and what was the animal like when it first got up here. And the closest we can come to this is that the animal that overwintered the Wisconsin glaciation was probably in the headwaters in the somewhat elevated rivers like the populations in Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina today, and that it was probably living strongly in association with rock and not in association with vegetation, as it does now in a number of circumstances, and that very interestingly, the fish you're seeing in front of you is Esox reicherti, the Amur pike or Asian pike, which lives only in the Amur River on the border between Siberia and China, and has that very interesting ecological relationship. It does not live in vegetation. It lives out in the middle of moderately flowing streams as an adult, and it has this black spotted pattern, which is supposedly the typical pattern of Esox maskinongi. So I think we'll find that the muskellunge, when it was overwintering the glacier, the last one at least, we don't know anything about it previous to that, existed in conditions represented today by this Asian form and doubtless looked like this, since this pattern is much more suitable in rocks than is the barred pattern that we know from other situations. Another rather interesting thing that many people don't know very much about is that this animal was once hawked around the streets and sold as a commercial fish in extremely large quantities. And I think we're going to learn that what happened in the 1800s has left a legacy which we have not as yet recovered from. The records are very fragmentary. Most states are unaware or unfamiliar with what went on at that time because there was very little recording. And I have used the records of Ontario and Quebec because they are much more complete and they give a rather striking and somewhat horrifying picture. There were 13.2 million pounds of muskellunge harvested in Ontario from 1868 to 1901, and 2.8 million pounds harvested in Quebec from 1868 to 1936. So that the Canadian total was 16 million pounds and 750,000 pounds in 1898 alone, that peak that you see on the figure. The total catch over those years, 1868 to 1936, were in fact something like 1,069,958 fish. We're talking about lakes that now from which anglers harvest 720 fish a year, that were turning 13,000 fish into the commercial fishery. This led in 1937 to a considerable concern about the opportunity for the muskellunge, or maskinonge as it was officially called in Ontario, to be saved. And this work of the Ontario Federation and principally Dr. J.R. Diamond led to the beginning of the research project in Canada, and the research activity, and this fairly well parallels what was going on in the United States and has led, as a result of the concern, to the kinds of studies which are very definitely characterized by the work that has gone on in the state of Wisconsin and in New York and Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the other places where this animal has been a major concern. It is this kind of concern that brings us all together today, and it's this kind of concern and this kind of activity which I think are very important to us all, and the basis of the symposium is important, and that's why we need to have the concern and to go on. The kinds of activities which people get into associated with muskellunge are thought by some people to almost approach a secret society. And I thought, since if we're going to be accused of this, secret societies always have recognition signals and mottos and everything else. So I went back to Pliny in the Latin and I dreamed up a few that we can use. For anglers, non multa sed multum, not quantity but quality. The next one, for anglers promoting the release, carpent, tua, poma, nepotes. Your descendants shall gather your fruits. And you can use these when you meet one another. Hatchery crews. This I thought was a very good one. I think something they have strived for. Paolo Maori canimus. Let us raise a somewhat loftier strain. The noble animal coming out again. For managers, here's a typical one. Non omnia possums omnes. You can tell your boss that. We can't do everything. The only trouble is your boss will probably tell you, medio tutissimus ibis. A middle course is the safest for you to take. For researchers, felix qui potuit rerum cognoscere causas. Happy is he who could search out the causes of things. And I think it's very characteristic of the devotion that the kinds of people have put into this. For anglers at technical sessions, and you can stand up and shout this if things get pretty rough, sesquipedalia verba, 1.5 long words. I think you won't suffer from this too much, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation and the description of the work that the people will give you. And lastly, audacibus annui corruptus, look with favor on a bold beginning, because I think that's what this symposium is. Thank you.
this symposium with a series of papers this afternoon, this evening, and tomorrow morning on the biology, life history, and the ecology of the muskellunge, because I'm sure we all appreciate that the management of the species ultimately rests on our knowledge in these areas, and that even successful angling depends to a large extent upon such information. As Ed has just alluded to, there are concerns about the future of the muskellunge for a variety of different reasons, and at least one of these concerns has dealt with the topic of the reproduction and the early life history of the species. And so this seems very appropriate to begin our session here with a series of papers that are related to this general topic. And so we'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, if you'd like to step up here now, Jim Gammon. Jim is a professor of zoology at DePaul University in Indiana. Like several of us here, Jim is a displaced badger. He grew up in God's country, but he tells me that he still makes annual pilgrimages to a summer place that he has in Hayward. Jim has been at DePaul since 1961, but began his interest in muskellunge here in Wisconsin as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, originally working on the possibility of using muskie as a biological control animal for dealing with stunted panfish populations. And as a result of this work, he became interested in the subject of reproductive success. And so Jim is today going to talk about some of this work. The title of his topic is Sperm Production and Spawning Success in Muskellunge and Northern Pike.
Thank you, Bruce. When I told my wife I was going to be the first presentation on the program, her response was, "Why? Are they doing it chronologically?" Because the data, Ed, wherever you are, is not new. I have had it in a file for 20 years or more, and yet it's never been published. I never considered the work complete, but I guess research never is. Back in the 1950s and early 1960s, while studying the fish populations of two small lakes near Boulder Junction, I became interested in the early life history of muskellunge. Early life history of most species is less known than what we know about the moon, and that includes the muskellunge. I attempted to locate young of the year, had no success at all, and finally concluded that there were, in most even good muskellunge lakes, very few small young of the year muskellunge. I was also in contact with some old friends whom I see anew here, Art Emke and his colleagues at Woodruff, Leon Johnson and his colleagues at Spooner, and I was impressed by their reports that male muskellunge produce very little milt. So initially my interest in this began with a working hypothesis that muskellunge are relatively infertile, that the male produces only a little bit of milt, and that perhaps because of that there would be low fertility of eggs, of naturally spawned eggs, and therefore reproductive success was low. As we'll see as I go along, this hypothesis is rejected, but along the way there were some very interesting results. Actually, the study included 3 parts. I decided that in order to assess the possibility of low fertility on the part of the male, I would need to look at the annual cycle of spermatogenesis. I would need to make a determination of sperm production. And lastly, and most importantly, I would have to make collections of naturally spawned muskellunge and northern pike, if I could, eggs to determine just how fertile they were. We obtained muskellunge testis through the courtesy of anglers from around the Boulder Junction area during the summer and the fall, and from Indians at the Chippewa Reservation at Reserve in the winter time when the Indians are spearing them, and still do, I understand. If we can have the first slide, we'll begin with an examination, very brief examination of the cycle of spermatogenesis. This doesn't look like much, but this is a cross-section of muskellunge testis in the summer after spawning. The testis is very small. It consists of spermatogonia and a lot of connective tissue separated into small blind lobules called cysts. And here and there you can see some dark staining material which are remnants of unspawned sperm. As the summer goes along about the middle of August, you begin to see some changes, and these changes become more and more pronounced. The spermatogonia divide, becoming a number of different stages. We have primary spermatocytes here, secondary spermatocytes in this region, spermatids, and then finally the dark staining mass here, the spermatozoa themselves. This process of spermatogenesis accelerates during September, and it really gets going during October. And then as cold weather sets in, it begins to slow down. But by about the 1st of January, nearly all of the sperm that a male muskellunge is going to spawn the following spring is present. And this is a typical scene. Now, northern pike have essentially the same pattern, but in northern pike you would not see a little incompletely developed cyst like this. And in the muskellunge, we found that from 3 to 7% of the volume of the testis consisted of these undeveloped cysts, intermediate. And from their nuclei, the staining qualities, it appears that they will never develop. The rest of the mass is all mature spermatozoa. Testis size during this maximum developmental stage is small, both for northern pike and for muskellunge. And this particular graph shows the regression of testis weight in grams versus the body weight in kilograms for both northern pike and muskellunge. And perhaps I can boil down most of what's on this graph by saying that during the winter time, male muskellunge testis constitutes about 2% of the body weight of the male, and in muskellunge it's about 1%. And if you look at the size of a testis, a 2 kilogram, roughly 4.5 pounds of northern pike will have the same size of a testis as a 5 kilogram muskellunge, about 11 pound muskellunge. In other words, the muskellunge has a very small testis. We also determined sperm densities by macerating some of the tissue and in a process very similar to that used for counting red blood cells, determined that essentially there were about, 31 to 34 billion sperm produced per gram of tissue. There's a slightly larger density for northern pike, but this is statistically non-significant. So essentially they produce the same amount on a per weight basis. We also examined the density of sperm in just the lobular fluid, and we found that muskellunge had a higher density, But again, this difference was statistically non-significant. So in terms of the sperm production, just the weight of the test just tends to be in relationship to the amount of sperm available for spawning. The collection of naturally spawned northern pike and muskellunge eggs was accomplished by putting out 2-foot by 3-foot trays with screen bottoms in likely looking spawning areas. And then also by dredging in these areas for eggs that happen to be in the surrounding area. We spent a lot of time picking eggs out of vegetation, especially elodea and knockers, that sort of thing. We tried these out first on a cattail marsh in Lake Wingra, where we collected over 1,000 northern pike eggs in mid-April of 1960. Some of you were not born then, I dare say. In late April, we moved this operation to Aliquosh Lake near Woodruff, and this happens to be a shot of lower Aliquosh Lake, and we deployed the trays in these shallow, weedy areas. You'll not be able to see that one, so I'll bypass it. You might be able to see this one. It's the best shot I have, I think, showing the tray in place here, very near shore. And these trays were surprisingly effective, we found, in collecting eggs. We never did see spawning fish, but when we collected day to day, why there would be at times eggs in those trays. In early May, we moved the operation to Big Trout Lake. Now, our research lab at that time was on the east shore of the lake in the lower part, over in this region here. Big Trout Lake is an oligotrophic lake with lake trout and whitefish and cisco, as those of you in the area know. It also has northern pike and a good population of muskellunge for a lake of this type. It also has a small bay off the northern basin, which was shallow and weedy, and into which muskellunge came to spawn in the spring. And this shows typical habitat of the area, and again you can see one of the trays in place here. And also here. These beds are almost solid anachorous with just debris here. We also place some of these in near shore in other areas, but this turned out to be the best place to collect eggs. Believe it or not, there's a pair of spawning muskellunge in there, but I've never been able to find them. Right there. And I just had to show it even though it's a bad slide. But you could see as you looked, you could see spawners coming in. And the first time I saw some spawners over one of these trays, I rubbed my hands gleefully, came back the next day to count thousands of eggs, and found none. And then I looked around the tray, and there were all kinds of minnows and small perch, and they were just gobbling them up as fast as they could go. So we ended up by putting a larger, coarser mesh frame over the original tray so the eggs could filter down through, and then also receive some protection. And using that device, we began to get some results. This summarizes all of the egg collections that we made. The northern pike, we collected a bit over 1,000 eggs. Just about half of them were viable, and the other half were dead. When we went to Aliquosh Lake, which also has northern pike as well as muskellunge, we were faced with the problem of trying to distinguish one species from another. And just on the basis of temperature at the time of eggs collected, it appeared like the end of April was a period where northern pike spawned, and the beginning of May, or the middle of May actually, was a time when muskellunge spawned. And in the early period, if these were northern pike, and I think they probably were, nearly 71% were fertile. For the muskellunge, this one collection involving just a bit over 100 eggs, only 31% were fertile. But in Trout Lake, we had a few eggs that first year, 70%, more than 70% of which were fertile. And then in the nets, the vegetation yielded eggs in greater abundance, but nearly a third of them were fertile, but 2/3 were infertile. Now, I, at that point, moved to Indiana and began teaching, but I kept my curiosity, and in 1964 made a very fast trip after being told that the muskies were in spawning, and ready to go now with good equipment. We again collected eggs. Of course, one never knows what the weather is going to bring. But at any rate, we did succeed within a week's time of collecting about 200 naturally spawned eggs in the trays, and of these, 88% were fertile. We kept those in the laboratory at the same temperature and in aerated water, and there was a slight die-off, but after 3 more days of incubation, there was still nearly 50% of the eggs which were fertile and developing quite nicely. Of the eggs taken in the vegetation, and much of this was right in the neighborhood of the trays and probably the same eggs, but also having eggs of unknown age, only 21% of those were fertile, and nearly 80% were dead. The conclusions that one draws then from this information is that initially fertilization of muskellunge eggs is high, and this contrasts with some of Ed Schneeberger's work in the middle 1930s. Ed took a number of eggs and found only 37% to be fertile, but again, that was a small sample. Assuming an equally high fertility rate for eggs recovered from vegetation, the eggs deposited on vegetation appear to suffer a large mortality rate. I think Mike Dombeck will have something to say about that later. And thirdly, muskellunge are top carnivores ecologically, but their eggs and probably their fry may be heavily preyed upon by minnows and perch at times. Thank you.
Okay, Jim has done an admirable job in staying within the time limit, and so we do have time for questions. I'd like to remind you to raise your hand. We'll recognize you, and then Jim will repeat the question before he answers. So, any questions?
So your study, as far as you see it, in terms of the time that season should be open for fishing. Like your study seemed to imply that mid-May in Wisconsin, the muskies are still spawning. What are the implications for angling at the same time?
The question is, what significance does this research have with regard to the opening of muskellunge season? I can't tell you. Certainly the muskellunge are vulnerable by virtue of coming into shallow water at that time. Whether or not they are like bass and will take a lure, I don't know. But certainly they are vulnerable to be seen, to be speared, to be snagged. This is closely tied to temperature. The peak spawning during the years we collected muskellunge eggs occurred when the morning temperatures were around 8 to 9 degrees centigrade, and then if it was a warm day it would warm up to perhaps 12 to 13 degrees. I don't know when the angling season begins. I understand from a sign it's late May now. And if that's the case, it would seem that spawning would be complete by the end of May. Yes, sir.
The use of the spawning trays, it must be spawning areas with the mesh on it to prevent predation by the perch might help improve muskie spawning success?
I don't know. That's a possibility, but this work is exploratory, tentative. Really, it's just getting started. I'm glad for an opportunity for this symposium to bring these results to you. We don't know much about the reproductive success. It would be nice to have a high fertility rate, a high hatching rate, a high survival of fry. From what I had seen, especially in Trout Lake, there's an enormous predation on the eggs and probably on the fry by these small, usual food, getting back at the muskie, so to speak. I would think that this would be a very good area to look at. What factors will encourage larger natural recruitment? My impression is that this is normally very, very low, and anything that could be done to improve that would be beneficial. Since moving to Indiana, I've become very conscious of pollution, habitat change, which has proceeded at a rapid rate down there, I suspect up here too now. It would seem to me absolutely essential to protect known areas of muskellunge spawning. And I'm not sure what is going on in this state and other places to do that. Yes, sir.
What general depth for the egg collecting crate you have?
Mostly shallow water, less than 3 feet. I tried them in water as deep as 6 feet, but with limited success. For the most part, the muskellunge appeared to come into very shallow water, not only over vegetation, but along the shore over dead leaves.
Detailed knowledge about the actual spawning, the spawning habitats, the time of spawning is a very essential element in the management of the species, and I think it may come as a surprise to many of you that in the research literature at least, we have little of this type of information until comparatively recently. And in part, we've enjoyed success in recent years by application of biotelemetry to track the spawning animals. And our next paper is going to deal with this subject. Our speaker is Bob Strand. Bob is the chairman of the Symposium Technical Steering Committee and is a research fisheries biologist for the Minnesota DNR. He served in this role for 18 years. He's a native of Minnesota, now works out of the prime Muskie area around Bemidji, Minnesota. In addition to his work that he's going to describe today, he has been involved in a Muskies Inc. project related to the genetics of muskie. You're going to hear about this later on today. And has been involved with decisions to switch strains that are used in cultural operations in Minnesota and in decisions to change dates on the season. He also notes that he is a frustrated muskie angler. Bob is going to speak on the identification of principal spawning areas and seasonal distribution and movements of muskellunge within Leech Lake by radio telemetry.
investigation on which I'm reporting was done in the years 1979 and 1980, and this work was accomplished with considerable volunteer help from anglers. If I could have the slides. Leech Lake is located in north-central Minnesota, approximately 167 kilometers west of Duluth and 257 kilometers northwest of Minneapolis-St. Paul. The sport catch from this naturally reproducing muskie population approximates one-half the annual catch in the state. Prior effort by Minnesota DNR over a period of 15 years was unsuccessful in attempting to determine spawning areas and obtain eggs for propagation through netting. Leech Lake is an irregularly shaped lake of 45,000 hectares that was formed by a marine dam. The lake has 306 kilometers of shoreline. Walleye, northern pike, and muskelunge are the main predators, and yellow perch are abundant throughout the lake. White sucker, cisco, lake whitefish, and rock bass are common. 3 areas on the lake where muskies tend to be most abundant were selected as study sites. They are indicated by the clear areas on the slide and consist of Walker Bay and 2 areas in the main basin, Pelican Island and Portage Bay. The morphometry of Walker Bay is oligotrophic, but the fertility of the water is high and the basin is classified as mesotrophic. A thermocline forms at about 10 meters during midsummer, and maximum depth is 54 meters in Walker Bay. Productive muskie angling areas are scattered throughout Walker Bay and consist mainly of steep shoreline drop-offs associated with weed beds and to a lesser extent rock. The main basin areas differ in the relative amount of substrate materials and the regularity of bottom contours. Neither of the main basin areas thermally stratify. The area about Pelican Island is characterized by rocky reefs to depths of 3 to 4 meters, radiating in all directions from the island. Scattered weed beds of the genus Potamogeton are present in the area, and maximum depth is just over 8 meters. Portage Bay has very gradual contours and a maximum depth of 9.2 meters. Muskie habitat consists entirely of Potamogeton weed beds and depths of 2 to 4 meters, extending for about 4.8 kilometers along the western shore and to a distance of up to 0.8 of a kilometer out into the bay. Our goal was to radio up to 5 adult muskies from each of the 3 study areas. Because of large lake size and the uncertainty of catching muskies, I had decided that implants would be made on the lake to minimize handling time. This 2-compartment steel tank was used to sedate fish, and the second compartment with an oxygen supply was used to revive fish and provide a prophylactic bath. The surgical tube was mounted on top of the tank on an incline which permitted the head and gill regions to remain covered while the abdominal implant area remained dry. This net, which I call a cradle, was made from knotless nylon webbing and proved very useful in handling fish. The fish were supported over the length of their bodies in a natural position and tended to remain quiescent. Our equipment was built by Cedar Creek Bioelectronics Lab. The actual transmitter used was 7 centimeters in length and 3 centimeters in diameter and weighed 28 grams in water. Minimum acceptable size for study fish was set at 85 centimeters to ensure a favorable weight ratio. Projected battery life was 12 months, but actual service was on the order of 18 months. Since we had been unable to capture muskies in nets on this lake, our study fish were taken by angling with artificial lures. And this, without a doubt, was the most exciting period of the study. We did use heavy tackle to minimize struggle time. Average struggle time was from 3 to 4 minutes. At this point, the fish is ready for landing. The fish was then placed in the tank for sedation with MS-222, which took from 5 to 6 minutes. Insertion of antenna and placement of the transmitter was by the shielded needle technique described by Ross and Kleiner in 1982. The transmitter was positioned above the pelvic girdle and did not rest on the incision. After closure, each fish received a dorsal tag. Surgery time plus attachment of tag averaged 12 minutes per fish. Surface temperatures ranged from 19 to 24 degrees at time of implants. The fish was then returned to the oxygenated tank for revival and a prophylactic bath for 12 minutes, and the fish was then released at capture site. 4 types of antenna were used with boat, snowmobile, and airplane to track fish. This is a handheld directional loop which had a maximum range of 0.4 of a kilometer. A Yagi mast antenna was also used extensively and had a maximum range of 1.6 kilometers. Aircraft were also used with twin directional antennas which had a range of up to 4.8 kilometers. Whip antennas of decreasing length were used when in close proximity to radioed fish to provide more precise determination of location. A total of 14 adult muskies, ranging from 85 to 122 centimeters total length, were radioed. All survived capture by angling and the surgery required for tag implants. A single study fish was lost to sport fishing 20 days after release, and 1 fish died from unknown causes approximately 172 days after release. Mean tracking time for the 12 remaining fish was 396 days, and a total of 405 radio locations were determined during that period. Spawning sites were determined for 10 of the 12 fish in spring of 1980. They are represented by 6 separate areas indicated by the white triangles and numbered 1 through 6. The capture nets in this scene are set on one of the spawning sites identified. The spawning areas were all distinctly offshore, depths of 1 to 2 meters over a soft calcareous substrate. Oxygen depletion at the substrate-water interface does not occur on these areas. Chara is the dominant vegetation. The areas are quite large, in some cases being over 100 hectares. Physical characteristics of the 6 examined areas are very similar, even though widely separated geographically. And selection for these sites occurred even though a wide variety of habitat types are available, and thus are presumed to be representative of preferred spawning habitat. Movement to the spawning areas began shortly after ice out when surface temperatures reached 8.3 degrees. These moves were represented by distances of 5 to 21 kilometers. Movements were direct and frequently included crossing large expanses of open water rather than irregular courses of travel along depth contours or shoreline. Radio signals during this period were very strong, suggesting the traveling fish were high in the water column. Typical movements to spawning sites are exhibited by study fish 521 and 461 on this slide, which depicts known locations and assumed travel routes. Fish 521, indicated by the triangles connected by solid lines, was located on a rock reef northwest of Pelican Island on 26 April. Was located on the rock reef on 9 April. Next contact was on 26 April when the fish was located to the east of Goose Island and a distance here of about 9.6 kilometers. Radio signals on 26 April indicated the fish was moving in a westerly direction and was remaining under the receding ice pack. The 9.6 kilometer move probably occurred over a short period of time, as evidenced by other tagged fish movements. On 28 April, the fish was 1.1 kilometers further west and was still remaining under the receding ice pack. The fish then moved 11.4 kilometers to the north end of Sucker Bay, where it was located on spawning area 2 on 1 May. Fish 461, indicated by the circles connected by dashed lines, was located in Urim Bay on the south end of the lake from 25 to 27 April. The fish then moved 3.5 kilometers north, where it was located on 1 May and remained until at least the afternoon of 6 May. On 8 May, the fish was not located, but the fish was located on 9 May on spawning area 3 in Sucker Bay. This represents a minimum distance traveled of nearly 18 kilometers in less than 72 hours. Study fish were not sexed at time of implants during midsummer. Later recaptures of several of these fish by anglers allowed examination and sex determination. While this could not be done for all study fish, it does permit limited observations on spawning differences between sexes. Males move onto the spawning grounds first, penetrate farther onto the areas, and remain on the sites more consistently and later than females. Females tend to frequent the periphery of spawning sites to a greater extent than males. Both sexes are sensitive to severe weather changes, and females are more sensitive than males. The actual spawning act was not observed on these sites, and attempts to sample eggs by siphon pump for verification of use were unsuccessful. Negative egg sampling results are attributed to the large size of these areas, which precluded intensive sampling, and to relatively low densities of spawning muskies. It was concluded that these were spawning sites based on intensive monitoring of tagged fish throughout the period when spawning would occur. Study fish traveled directly to these areas and remained there, and following cold front which caused them to move off the sites to deeper water, returned to the same areas with the return of warm weather. It is also based on the observation of behavioral changes associated with spawning, which were observed. Ripe musklunge have been successfully captured in nets on these locations for 3 consecutive years following the telemetry study. From the combined data, muskie spawning in Leech Lake occurs from 15 to 35 days after complete ice out at water temperatures of 11.6 to 14 degrees, although short-term fluctuations in temperature outside of that range frequently occur. Mean home range values for Leech Lake musklunge are listed in kilometers squared. These values are listed under 4 categories: total with spawning, total without spawning, summer, and winter, and the mean values are listed for fish in the main basin and for Walker Bay. Home range calculations included movements associated with spawning, which were frequently extensive and substantially increased the size of total home range. Mean total home range values were 69 kilometers squared on the main basin and 13.7 kilometers squared in Walker Bay. With spawning movements excluded from total home range, the mean value for fish residing in the main basin was nearly 37 kilometers squared, and for Walker Bay, 7.6 kilometers squared. The size of summer home range was determined for 11 fish and winter home range of 9 individuals, and those mean values are listed as well. Knowledge of muskie home range is sparse. Home range values determined for Leech Lake are considerably greater than values reported by Miner and Crossman in 1978, Dombeck in 1979, and Miller and Menzel in 1982. Their investigations involved bodies of water from 35 to 3,700 hectares as compared with 45,000 hectare Leech Lake. Haas in 1978 indicated that muskies have an extensive seasonal pattern up to 40 kilometers on Lake St. Clair, which has a surface area of over 100,000 hectares. These data suggest that home range size may be a function of lake size. Prey abundance and movement may be a factor influencing muskellunge movement in Leech Lake, but those considerations were beyond the scope of the study. Marked differences in home range and movement were observed for muskellunge inhabiting disparate environments within the lake. Fish residing in the main basin occupied total home ranges exclusive of spawning, which were nearly 5 times larger than those of fish inhabiting Walker Bay. Muskellunge in the main lake basin tended to have winter home ranges distinctly separate from summer home range, with winter home ranges being larger than summer by a factor of nearly 2. Typical summer-winter ranges of fish in the main basin are illustrated by fish 461 from Portage Bay and fish 379 from Pelican Island. Fish 461, Portage Bay fish indicated by the summer home range here. Winter home range for that same fish near the bottom of the slide indicated by this area here. Winter-summer range separated by approximately 18 kilometers in that case. Fish 379 from Pelican Island, summer home range for that individual here, winter home range for the same individual here. These fish exhibit a trend that was observed for all fish from the main basin, that being that all of the Portage Bay group with summer home ranges in that vicinity indicated winter home ranges distinctly to the south of summer home range. In contrast, the Pelican Island group, indicating summer home ranges in this vicinity, all exhibited winter home range in the opposite direction, to the north or to the northeast of summer home range. Walker Bay fish had winter home ranges which were smaller than summer by a factor of over 6, and winter ranges were essentially contained within the summer ranges. Typical summer-winter ranges in Walker Bay are illustrated for fish 538, the larger crosshatched area being summer home range, the smaller clear area within being winter home range for that individual. The summer home range of fish 521, originally tagged in Portage Bay, differed from other tagged fish in that it utilized 3 widely separated areas. The 3 summer areas utilized by this fish are indicated by these 3 areas here, and the fish apparently traveled directly between these areas without inhabiting the regions between. Use of these 3 areas was not characterized by a seasonal progression through the areas. And then winter home range for this same individual showing the same pattern described earlier, being to the south. In conclusion, survival of angler-caught fish, additionally subjected to the surgery required for implants, strongly suggests that catch and release of muskellunge is a realistic management option. Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting presentation, Bob. And in the interest of keeping on schedule, I think we are going to have to ask you to ask questions about fisheries biologist for the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, a position he's held for the last 12 years. Robin is involved in many aspects of fisheries and wildlife management, and today he's going to be talking about a major trophy fishery in Georgian Bay of Lake Huron, an area where loss of habitat, and particularly nursery habitat, is of a concern. And he's going to be approaching this from a management perspective. The title of his presentation is Muskellunge Nursery Habitat in Southern Georgian Bay, and his co-author on the paper is Ron Black, also a biologist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Bruce. We can have the first slide, please. Well, over here. Okay, let me get all this equipment figured out. Okay, there we go. Nursery habitat of muskellunge in southern Georgian Bay. Muskellunge provide an important trophy fishery in Georgian Bay, with fish up to 23 kilograms or 50 pounds in weight being caught annually. Georgian Bay is also an important recreational resource for boaters, summer residents, and campers. Resorts, cottages, and marinas are numerous on the bay, as the area is located within 200 kilometers of major population centers in southern Ontario. Many shores are still natural, but the demand to develop these waterfronts are continuing. As well, existing shoreline residents eventually wish to improve their shorelines. They want to dredge for boating access, they want to fill to increase their property boundaries, they want to remove aquatic vegetation to improve the swimming or the aesthetics of their property, they want to dump sand to create beaches. Fisheries biologists must mitigate proposals like these to protect important littoral areas, while at the same time accommodating the needs of the many recreationist developers and shore property owners. However, as already has been stated, the nearshore habitat requirements of muskellunge are not well known, and this makes the manager's task even more difficult. It is known that muskie generally spawn over vegetation in water 38 to 50 centimeters deep, and that after hatching they remain closely associated with vegetation before becoming active and feeding. There is a little information to suggest that emergent vegetation plays a role in providing protective cover for them, and that forage fish are required when they do turn to a fish diet. But little information is available on the species of plants that are involved, the densities that are involved, or the kinds of fish that live in the same places as muskellunge. The objectives of this study then were to describe the nursery requirements of young-of-the-year Great Lakes muskellunge in southern Georgian Bay and look at some of the fish community associations. Georgian Bay, you can see in the upper right, is a large, deep, cold water lake. Oligotrophic, as the scientists call it. The typical fish species are included before they became extinct: lake trout and whitefish. However, muskellunge are found along the eastern shore, where the waters are much more shallow, warmer, and productive. Now, this study took place in the southeastern corner of Georgian Bay, in an area known as Severn Sound. The sound is bounded on the north by the Precambrian Shield, and on the south by the Paleozoic landmass of southern Ontario. Now, the habitats that were investigated are all located along the north shore in the Precambrian Shield area. The waters in this area are very productive because the sound receives the drainage of several river systems that flow through the agricultural lands to the south, bringing nutrients to the area. Initially, local fishing guides provided us with information on spawning habitats of the muskellunge. Now, we considered that spawning areas would probably be very close to nursery areas, and this gave us a starting point for the investigation. From there, we attempted to identify potential spawning sites visually by comparing them with the sites that we had a bit of information on. We pretended we were muskie looking for good spawning sites using the data that had been given us. Now, fish were collected during the study in the selected habitats using a 15-meter long seine net during the months of June and July in 1981. In the center here we have a young of the year muskie, just to give you an idea of the size. Those are, the mesh in the seine is 6.4 millimeters. We kept records on the species of fish we caught along with the muskie in the seining process, the abundance of these species, and the total lengths of all the muskie that we captured. As well, we took data on the physical characteristics of the site, including water temperature, bottom type, and the habitat orientation. The vegetation was surveyed between mid-July and mid-August, when it was the fruiting bodies were available to help us with identification. And the vegetation was only surveyed in habitats in which we caught young of the year muskellunge. Now, generally, the way the vegetation was surveyed is that we established 3 transects, approximately 10 meters apart, running perpendicular to the shoreline out through the habitat to a depth of about 1 meter. Now, all the species and numbers of stems of emergent vegetation were counted within 1/4 square meter quadrats, placed 2 meters apart along each transect, so that we had a representative sample from the shore out to the deep, and that we had the numbers of areas that we could measure reasonably. We started right at the shore water interface and went out to 1 meter of water. As well, the percent coverage of submergent vegetation was estimated visually for each quadrat, and the species and abundance of the submergents as well were documented. We identified 103 potential sites in which we did seining and looking for young of the year muskie. But we only found young of the year muskie at 20 sites. Now this might possibly be a problem with the technique we use to capture fish. But essentially what we wanted to do was to identify the habitats where we could definitely find young muskie and see what they were using. So our numbers weren't as important as identifying the fact that some were using it. As well, 19 other fish species were inhabiting the area with the young muskie. And an average of 4.9 fish species were found in each habitat occupied by a muskie. Pumpkin seed, largemouth bass, and yellow perch occurred at 75% or more of the habitats, and were also the most abundant fish, with largemouth bass representing or being present 25.7 per habitat, 14.1 pumpkin seeds, and 10.9 yellow perch, in conjunction with each habitat as we seine. We captured 34 muskellunge young of the year, and their mean total length was 49.7 millimeters. The lengths range from 16 millimeters for a fish caught in June, near the end of June, June 23rd, to 97.5 millimeters for a fish caught in mid-July. The water temperature during the study period averaged 24 degrees Celsius. The mean transect length, and they varied from site to site, or the habitat distance from shore, which we considered was being used, was 23.8 meters. The bottom type was either sand, like this, or muck, and most of the habitats were oriented in a westerly direction. All the habitats investigated contained emergent vegetation, and we identified 15 different families. Each habitat contained an average of 7.9 families of emergent vegetation. Arrowhead and grasses occurred at 100% of the habitats. Sedges, prickleweed, and water lilies occurred at more than 80% of the sites. But the most abundant were the sedges, representing 52% of the stems in our sample quadrats. All other families represented less than 10% of the stems when we got to counting them. So although we had a large number of families represented, the sedge family represented over half of the vegetation at any one site, and then there was a smattering of all these other ones. As well, we did some of the submergent vegetation was found in all the habitats, and there were 22 species encountered during the study with an average of 8.9 per habitat. The most abundant, though, were bushy pondweed, muskgrass, and variable pondweed. For descriptive analysis, we grouped the quadrats because the transect lengths vary, so we couldn't figure out averages across the board. So what we did was, in the nearshore area, we considered those quadrats relatively equal, and for 2 meters from shore, we grouped all the information there. And then offshore, the habitat became somewhat more similar to an offshore habitat. And from here to about here, about a distance of 20 meters, we divided the transects in half by their midpoint. And then in the offshore area, out here, when we reached 1 meter depth, all transects stopped at 1 meter. Again, we felt there was a similarity at that depth that we could group some of the data into a 2 meter band on the outside of the habitat. This is what we were aiming for as managers, to find out how we could tell muskie habitat without actually having to catch the fish himself, because of the difficulty involved. Well, this is what I call a typical Georgian Bay muskellunge habitat, nursery habitat. It consists of a dense band of vegetation near shore, emergent vegetation, with upwards of 300 stems per square meter. The main species involved in this nearshore band are the common spike rush and a plant we call common 3-square. This is adjacent to this is this wider band, approximately 20 meters in total, of less dense emergent vegetation. And you can see the densities have dropped off tremendously. We get down to 100 to roughly 50 to 100 stems per square meter in this area here, this large area off this nearshore area. And then as we get farther offshore and into a depth of 1 meter, out here, there's another an area in which emergent vegetation is very sparse, somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 25 stems per square meter. As well, we saw a species change from the spike rush and 3-square up here to soft stem bulrush offshore. Now, we're all members of the sedge family, but there was a species change as we did go offshore. As well, with submergent vegetation, it was less than 20% in the nearshore band and increased to approximately 50% in all the offshore areas. The bottom is generally sand or muck, gently sloping, and the habitat runs about 20 to 25 meters offshore. As well, 5 other species shared this habitat with the young muskellunge, including members of the minnow, sunfish, and perch families. Aquatic vegetation plays a very important role in the life of muskellunge, as eggs are deposited on the previous season's growth, generally in the dense nearshore vegetation in Georgian Bay. As well, the fry, the one right in the center here, the fry find protection in this dense nearshore vegetation and probably hide here for a while their egg sacs are absorbing and they prepare to assume an active feeding life. As well, the young muskies are predators themselves and ambush prey from within aquatic vegetation. They'll likely move offshore into this intermediate density vegetation of 50 to 100 stems per square meter, where conditions are probably optimal for food and at the same time optimal for not being eaten. The muskie as well probably do not venture out into that sparser area of vegetation, 23.8 or whatever it was meters from shore, where we see less than 25 stems per square meter, because their opportunities to feed become less and their chances of being predated are greater. As well, the availability of forage is very important to muskie stock densities, as it is with other esophagids. especially northern pike. And the preferred prey of muskie, yellow perch and minnows, spawn and utilize vegetated nearshore habitats. These, as well as members of the sunfish family, were abundant in all our Georgian Bay habitats. Muskellunge fry are not as easy to catch as some other members of their habitat or other representatives that are in their habitats. The species, abundance, and densities of aquatic vegetation are also fairly straightforward to document during the growing season, as are water temperatures and depths. Now, comparing these data with the typical Georgian Bay habitat description will allow the fisheries manager to identify potential habitats. Then the biologist can assess and mitigate the impacts of proposed shoreline developments on these areas. Muskie nursery habitats are generally not well suited to other forms of recreation. They're too mucky, they're too weedy, they're too shallow. On the other hand, alterations to these aquatic habitats or the aquatic plant community can reduce spawning and nursery habitat available for production. Several populations of muskies and their close relatives northern pike and chain pickerel are declining in several lakes across North America, and the assumed cause is disruption to the aquatic flora. Herbicides are often used to control submergence, and in themselves may not harm the eggs or fry of muskie, but they can reduce invertebrate food supplies, which are essential in the early life history, and if these food supplies are lost at critical times, it can be quite devastating to the fry development. As well, some research has shown that you can shift plant communities by continued use of selected herbicides, with the result of a monoculture of a more tolerant species, leading to ecological instability. Mechanical harvesting is an alternative to herbicide use, but fish can be also killed by becoming entangled in the cut weeds, especially with larger machinery as it's removing the plant material. The cutting process can also disrupt fish distribution, leading to increased mortality because of loss of feeding opportunities, increased predation, and competition for remaining habitats. Now, the impacts may be minimal if the cutting is limited, but they can be significant if the cutting is extensive. Dredging and filling can kill plants directly, and they change the littoral area depths so that the reestablishment of emergent vegetation is highly unlikely. Spawning in nursery sites may be totally eliminated with these kinds of actions. This kind of work in the water can also lead to suspended silt becoming apparent, and this will restrict light penetration and reduce submergent plant growth. Or silt deposition during spawning periods could increase muskie egg mortality in nearby habitats which aren't even being affected by the actual work. The future management of muskellunge, then, should not only include the harvest regulations and control of poaching, but must also recognize the importance of spawning and nursery habitats. Fisheries biologists need to assess the impacts of proposals which will alter habitats and should recommend restricting them in muskellunge production areas. Environmentally sensitive shorelines should be designated for limited development in official planning and zoning documents. Biologists will also be required to provide education and information to local governments, planning agencies, and shore property owners to help protect necessary nearshore habitats along already developed shorelines. The continued production, then, of the highly valuable and trophy muskellunge in southern Georgia Bay will require the identification, protection, and management of critical habitats in concert with the onshore and in-water activities of the local human population. Do you have any questions?
Do we have any questions? I guess not.
Okay.
Oh, little Chippy, Don't you